we need, Richard needs 2 hours for the talk, so that if you, and he'll handle questions after 2 hours. So if you have to leave at 5 or before.
If you want to leave at any time, you're free to go. You're not prisoners here.
The free auditorium as well as the free software, yes.
I'll make it faster if I can, but experience says this topic lasts about 2 hours.
Okay.
If you're still outside the door, I suggest you come in and sit on the floor or something like that.
There are some seats up here as well on the side.
Unless you're not sure whether you want to stay and you want to be able to make an unobtrusive getaway.
Okay, stand by.
We get going. Okay, welcome. I'm Bill Dutton. I'm the director of the Quello Center. Really lovely to see such a good group here today. Richard Stallman is president and founder of the Free Software Foundation. We're delighted to have him here. He is a graduate of Harvard University, where he did his undergraduate degree in physics, and then he went on to the MIT AI lab, where he worked for some years before he went off to make free software happen as the president and founder of the Free Software Association.
Free Software Foundation.
Sorry. And he's won numerous awards, like honorary doctoral degrees. I think I'm most impressed with his MacArthur Foundation Fellowship. He's a pioneer both in free software, but also coined the term copyleft. Am I correct about that? And he not only has spoken about free software for many years, but he lives that, as you saw, and he introduced at the beginning of the talk. So may we welcome Richard in the usual manner, and thank you for coming.
So, if you're interested in taking photos and you didn't hear what I said about taking photos, please raise your hand now. Well, basically, don't put them in Facebook, Instagram, or WhatsApp. And turn off, if you're going to take them with a mobile device, turn off geolocation in photos before you take them. That's to respect my privacy. And if anyone wants to make a video or audio recording and wasn't here when I talked about that, please raise your hand now. Good, everybody already heard. So, we've seen many projects that say that their goal is digital inclusion or closing the digital divide. They want everyone to be part of a digital society. And I'm not convinced that's a desirable goal. That depends on whether the digital society in question is just or unjust. If it's just, we should help everyone be part of it. And if it's unjust, we should help everyone get out of it. Instead of digital exclusion, we need digital extraction. Of course, it's not clear whether the digital society will be just or unjust. We see that it has numerous threats to our freedom today, and whether they will leave us freedom or take it away depends on you. So I'm going to talk about these threats to our freedom in the digital society. And the most basic one, at the root of several others, is software that the users do not have control over. Software that gives someone else power over whoever uses it. In other words, software that isn't free. Now, when I say free software, I'm talking about freedom, not price. I don't care, frankly, whether you pay for a copy of a program or get it at no charge, because neither one is wrong. Paying somebody else money for something is not in general wrong. A non-free program is one that a free program respects users' freedom and community. That's morally important. So if the program respects freedom and community, it's okay. And if you paid for it, that doesn't matter. Doesn't change anything. On the other hand, if it doesn't respect users' freedom and community, then it subjugates users, and that's unacceptable even if the program is available gratis, as many non-free programs in fact are available gratis, but they're still unjust. So whenever I mean zero price, I say gratis. I reserve the word free for issues of freedom. And sometimes we actually say libre, which is sort of mispronouncing either a French or Spanish word, to emphasize we don't mean gratis. But what is a program? What's a computer? Well, a computer is a universal computing engine. And all it knows how to do is one very simple thing, conceptually simple. Get the next instruction and do whatever that says. And it does it over and over. Get the next instruction, do what that says. Get the next instruction, do what that says. Millions of times a second. The instructions come from a program. And depending on what instructions that program has in it, the same computer will do various different things. To make a computer do something, you have to write a program with the proper instructions to tell the computer what to do. And depending on what program is giving the instructions, the same computer can do basically anything within the limits of what's possible. Some things a computer just can't do. But for the things that a computer can do, the right program will make it do any of them. So the crucial moral question about using a computer is, who gives the instructions to your computer? You might think it's you, when really it's somebody else. You might think your computer obeys you, when really it's obeying its real master in first place and does what you say when the real master approves. With any program, there are two possibilities. Either the users control the program or the program controls the users. There's no other options. It's always one or the other. When the users control the program, that's free software. Why so? Well, freedom means having control of your own life, having control of the activities that you do in your life. But if you use a program to do the activity, that requires having control of the program itself. So, when the users control the program, that program respects their freedom and also their community. That I'll explain in a few minutes. So, it's free software. If the users don't control the program, then that program does not respect their freedom and community, which means it shouldn't exist. Practically speaking, a program is free software if it gives users the four essential freedoms. Freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program however you wish for whatever purpose. Freedom 1 is the freedom to study the program's source code and change it to make the program do the computing activity the way you wish. Why is source code essential? Well, here's some source code. It looks like a combination of English and math. If you've learned that programming language, you can read the source code, you can see what it does, you can figure out what the program does, and then you can change it to do something else. But in order to run it, typically the program is converted into some sort of executable code. Executable code is a series of enigmatic ones and zeros. For a tiny program like this, it's not that hard to figure out what they mean. But for a real program, something that might say be 100,000 lines of source code, in executable form to figure out what that tremendous long list of ones and zeros means is very hard. It's called reverse engineering, and it's one method of reverse engineering, and it's so hard people only do it as a desperate last resort. So, if we told users, you're free to change this, but you'll have to reverse engineer it first in order to be able to change it, that's not respecting people's freedom, one. That's just mockery. So, in order for people to have the freedom to change the program and make it do their activities the way they wish, they've got to have the source code. So these two freedoms give each user separately control over that program. Here we see 4 users using the same program. One of them is exercising this separate control, changing a copy of the program to work differently, and the others are using it just the way they got it. So each one of them has the freedom to change it. One of them chooses to exercise that right, and the other 3 choose not to. Well, separate control is absolutely essential, but it's not enough because most users don't know how to program. They have other talents, other interests. They've learned to do other things, which may be just as admirable and useful as writing software. And there's no reason why everybody should have to learn programming. But the users that don't know how to program also deserve. Could you leave it open, please? Leave the door open, please. The person who's out there at the desk may want to hear the talk, and we should cooperate with that. So, the way they get to participate is through collective control, which is the freedom to work together with others, collaborating to change the program to do what the people in this group decide they should want it to do. Now, the group can be formal or informal. Whichever users cooperate, they're a group, and they have the right to do this. So at the top, we see a group of 3 users. I've depicted 3 humans, but they don't have to be humans. They could be businesses or governments or whatever, or user groups. The point is that 2 of them are directly changing the code. They must be programmers. And the third one is not directly changing the code. Maybe that person doesn't know how to program, but does participate in controlling the program through discussions with the other 2 about what changes to make. You don't have to cooperate with others in this. You can just use the program just by yourself. At the bottom, there are 2 more users that are not joining in that project. At the top, they're using the program the way they got it. Why aren't they joining that project? Well, it's up to them. They could have any sort of reason to prefer not to. Like maybe they don't know those people at all. Maybe they don't know that project to change the program exists. Or maybe they don't like those 3 people. Or maybe they just disagree about what they want the program to do. They might think that those 3 people in that project there are perfectly sensible people, but they want something else. Or maybe tomorrow they'll get to know each other and decide to work together. Collective control requires 2 more essential freedoms. Freedom 2, to make exact copies and then give or sell them to others when you wish. And freedom 3, to make copies of your modified versions and give or sell them to others when you wish. So, these 2 freedoms permit people in a group to cooperate, or users in a group more generally to cooperate. If one user makes a modified version under Freedom 3, that user can distribute copies of the new version to others in the group, and they can then, using Freedom 2, make more copies and distribute them to others in the group. They can also offer copies to others, even publish those versions, which means offering copies to the general public. When the program gives the users all 4 essential freedoms, then it's free software, because the users have control over the program both separately and collectively. This is what's required for a program to respect users' freedom and community. Let me repeat the 4 freedoms, since some people missed the beginning. Freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program as you wish for any purpose. Freedom 1 is the freedom to study the program's source code and change it so it does your computing activity the way you wish. Freedom 2 is to make exact copies and give or sell them to others when you wish. And Freedom 3 is to make copies of a modified version and give or sell them to others when you wish. So when the program carries these 4 freedoms in an adequate way, thoroughly, then the users control the program. But if one of these freedoms is missing or incomplete, then the users don't fully control the program. Instead, the program controls the users, and the proprietor of the program controls the program, which means that indirectly the proprietor or developer controls the users. Has this non-free program, we've assumed it's non-free because it doesn't carry the 4 freedoms fully, is an instrument giving the developer unjust power over the users. This is power that nobody should ever have over anybody else. This is why every non-free program is an injustice. Non-free programs should not exist. Well, this injustice is bad enough, but because the developers know that they have power over the users, they face temptation. Power corrupts, and it corrupts them too, along with others that have power. So they face the temptation to try to gain advantage over their own users and thus get more money by designing the programs to mistreat their users. They put in malicious functionalities. Those are very common in non-free software today. Let me give you examples. Many non-free programs are designed to spy on the user, to send personal data to somebody. This example concerns the Amazon swindle, Amazon's ebook reader. That's not its official name, but that would be the appropriate name for such a device. Every so often, it sends the name of the book and the page number to Amazon servers. Even if the user got the book from someplace else, Amazon still knows that person is reading it. And if the user enters any notes, they're sent to Amazon. If the user highlights any text, it's sent to Amazon. It's total surveillance of what the user does. It's an Orwellian reading device. There are many more examples. Flash player snoops on users, Windows snoops on users, macOS snoops, Android snoops, the system of the iThings snoops, and lots of apps snoop. Even flashlight apps send personal data. Now, why do they need to communicate with anything? What information do they need in order to turn on the screen? Nothing. It's pure snooping, the fact that they communicate with websites. Of course, streaming websites snoop on people, they're tied to particular servers. That's known as tethering. The Fitbit does the same thing. It's tied to a particular server. The server collects the user's personal data and then offers to sell it back to the user. It's and it's a malicious functionality to design the program to depend on any particular server. But this is getting more and more common, especially in the Internet of Things. They have products that depend on, it's the standard practice to design a product so it depends on talking to a particular server, and sometimes the company decides to shut down the server and make the products not work anymore. There was an article last week. Somebody complained about the manufacturer, so the manufacturer shut off that user's account in the server, causing the product not to work at all. Now, the wrong here is not that the company acted in an arbitrary way. It's a mistake to address that wrong by saying the company should act with more thoughtfulness and deliberation and in an equitable fashion when controlling users. No, it was wrong to make that device so that it depended on any particular server in the first place. And this should show the general tendency nowadays that when computation mistreats users because it's designed to give some business or state power over people, people don't dare say, no, it shouldn't have given anybody power over us. They only dare suggest measures that hardly fix anything. Like, oh, tell them that they have a responsibility to decide according to some equitable criterion which users' products they should brick. Now imagine if your thermostat stops working because the server it talks to has been bricked. It's happening. So my decision is I won't tolerate anything in my home that talks to anything outside of my home, except for my computer, which is running only free software. But there's another form of malicious functionality, which is digital handcuffs, also known as digital restrictions management, or DRM. This is when the device is designed to stop people from doing things that they know the users are going to want to do, but their business interest is not to help users, but in fact to attack them and hurt them. Many proprietary products have some sort of DRM. This shows the infamous blue ray that attacks users when they want to copy something. DVDs do it also, but in the case of DVDs, it's easy to get free software and install it and use it. That breaks the handcuffs. So what I recommend is never use a product with DRM. That is, never use a product that was designed to stop you from doing with it what you wish, unless you personally have at hand what it takes to break the handcuffs. If the handcuffs can't bind you, if you can shrug them off, then you can ignore them. Otherwise, you should look at that product as an attack on your freedom and reject it. The nastiest cases are things like Netflix. Even if people find a way to break the DRM of Netflix, Netflix could tell everybody, upgrade the client program now, and in 5 minutes they could be using another different DRM scheme. So I regard Netflix as the ultimate enemy of our freedom. I won't even watch something through Netflix if it's running on someone else's computer. because I'm so filled with disgust at what Netflix tries to do to people. I'd rather not, whatever movie it is, I'd rather not watch it. There's no movie that could be so important to me that it would be worth tolerating the existence of Netflix. Going back to programs tied to a particular server, another horrible example is Uber. In order to call for a ride on Uber, one has to run a proprietary program. Well, of course, you shouldn't do that. And identify oneself. In other words, the program, together with the server that it always talks to, are snooping devices. And this threatens our freedom to move anonymously around the city. So we've got to get rid of Uber. Now, there are other bad things about Uber. For instance, it pays drivers peanuts, so I call it goober. And then it wants to get rid of them entirely. And those are good reasons also to refuse to use Goober. But even if Goober fixed that, I still would totally reject anything that requires people to identify themselves or run non-free software. I do sometimes take a taxi. I hail it on the street or by calling from anybody's telephone. And then I pay cash. They don't know who I am, and that's much safer for society. Another form of malicious functionality is the backdoor. A backdoor means the program receives a command from somebody else telling it to do something nasty to the user. Oh, I forgot to say, regarding DRM, all the proprietary operating systems, Windows, Mac OS, Android, and iOS, they all have code for DRM. And the Amazon Swindle has DRM, Flash Player has DRM, and many apps have DRM. Regarding backdoors, a backdoor means it receives commands from somebody else to do something to the user. And it doesn't have to be something nasty, but often it is. For instance, the Amazon Swindle has a backdoor for remote erasure of books. Amazon can do this by sending a command to the device, and so could anybody else who either knows the secret command to send or can force Amazon to do it. We know about this through observation. It's hard to tell that a proprietary program has a backdoor. The only way to find out is to observe it in operation. Well, in 2009, people observed that Amazon remotely erased thousands of copies of a particular book in a gross Orwellian act. A person came to my talk and told me that he had observed the book disappear as he was in the middle of reading it. And what was the book? It was 1984 by George Orwell. I wouldn't dare to make this up in fiction. It would be too incredible, but this is fact. There was a lot of criticism. So Amazon said it would never do this again unless ordered to by the state. If you've read 1984, that's not a very comforting promise, is it? But actually, it was not a promise at all. It had no force. It was just something for Amazon to say to pull the momentum out of the criticisms. A few years later, Amazon went back to remotely erasing books without even an order from the state. Now, we know of a few other backdoors, but first let me talk about censorship. Censorship of applications is what I'm talking about. The iPhone was the first general purpose computer that imposed censorship of applications. Users couldn't install the applications of their choice. They couldn't freely install any application program they could get. No, they could only install the programs approved by Apple from Apple's store. The users, when they found technical tricks to bypass the censorship, called it jailbreaking. So our term for such products is a jail. And although Apple was the first, Microsoft imitated the practice a couple of years later. And the worst thing in terms of malicious functionality is the universal backdoor. That means that the developer and maybe others that steal or demand the information necessary can remotely insert changes in the code. They can change the code in any way they like. Windows has a universal backdoor at least since Windows XP, meaning that Microsoft can forcibly impose changes and does. Microsoft refused to acknowledge this in Windows XP, but in Windows 7, Microsoft publicly stated that it had a universal backdoor, but instead of saying it that way, it tried to make it sound nice by calling the universal backdoor, quote, auto upgrade, unquote. Really, those are two different ways of describing the same thing. Microsoft can forcibly change the code in the user's machine. This means that Microsoft effectively has broken the security in that machine, has owned that computer. But what this shows you is that any proprietary program offers zero security against its developer. There are other universal backdoors known. For instance, in the Amazon swindle and in nearly all portable phones, they have a universal backdoor that is used more with a fair number of users to convert their phones into full-time listening devices. Any portable phone can be converted into a full-time listening device at a distance by sending it the proper commands through the radio. And once it's been converted, it listens all the time. And it transmits all the conversation it hears. It can hear all the conversation in the room. If any of you is carrying one of these devices, it could be transmitting my talk. Well, I don't mind. I've given these talks. We've published recordings. What I'm saying here is in no sense secret or private. We even published an invitation for anybody at all to come here and listen. But it's wrong to make people serve as spies on others in this way, or even spy at them through their own devices. And it's done with essentially no controls. And once the phone has been modified, it never shuts off either. You see, the phone doesn't have an off switch, only a button that says, "Oh, phone, would you please shut yourself off for me?" And the phone either does it or doesn't do it, and you can't tell. When it's been modified, it pretends to shut down while still running, listening, and transmitting just the same. There's no way to make those modified phones really shut themselves off. In addition, by triangulation of the radio signals, the phone network can determine where each phone is at any time. So it tells everywhere a person goes and can listen to all the conversations where the person is. I call this Stalin's dream. What would Stalin have wanted to do to everyone in the Soviet Union? give people a device that would track their movements and listen to their conversations, obviously. But poor Stalin couldn't do this because the technology didn't exist. Now it exists. Now, through portable phones and many other systems, we are subject to more surveillance than the inhabitants of the former Soviet Union. Oh, there's one other nasty thing the developer can do. Uh, we read in Bloomberg News that Microsoft, when it discovered security flaws in Windows, showed them to the NSA before fixing them. In other words, Microsoft was directly betraying all of its users. The article asked if anyone could ever trust Microsoft again. Of course, I would have said that was a useless question. What this shows is that proprietary software is very likely to be malware. I've only told you a few examples from a few companies. We have about 300 examples listed in gnu.org/proprietary, and they come with references in the press to document them. So, since this includes the widely used proprietary operating systems, you know that almost everyone that uses proprietary software is the victim of proprietary malware. Not just might be, but is. If a program is proprietary, you've got to figure it's quite likely to be malware. That's not always necessarily true. You see, there's no way to tell whether a proprietary program is malware. Certain kinds of malicious functionalities you'll notice. DRM you'll notice. Censorship of apps you'll notice. But snooping and backdoors, you won't necessarily notice that they exist even if they're functioning. So you can't tell, you can't check. You just have to expect it's probably malware. I'm sure there are proprietary programs which have no malicious functionalities, but we can't identify any of them because we can't check any given proprietary program to see if it is malware. We just have to figure the danger is pretty high. So every proprietary program is either known and established malware or possible malware. You've got to look at every proprietary program as possible malware. There's no way to check and no way to defend yourself, except don't use it. And why do they do this? They found ways to make more money by mistreating their own clients. Often they will develop a program in order to lure people into being its users so they can mistreat those people. In other words, the malicious functionality is for them the purpose for the program. If the program attracts users, then they say, good, here's some people we can mistreat. And you can never tell whether they're doing it, so you've got to figure that the proprietary program is mistreating you. In other words, there is no rational basis to trust a proprietary program. You're basically asking to be taken. The only way to use it is blind faith. Often blind faith in a company that has already proved it doesn't deserve that faith by mistreating people through other programs before. The only defense against malicious functionalities is free software. With free software, the users control the program. The users can study the source code. If they find anything malicious, or more likely an error, they're also free to fix it too. And if some users find it and fix it, they will announce this. And that way the fix will get to other users. You don't need to be a programmer to get the benefit of the community's protection. Now, this is not guaranteed. No guaranteed defense against malicious functionalities is known. But at least it's a defense. It's much better than being defenseless as the user of a proprietary program. What's more, we free software developers still have a sense of right and wrong. And the reason is we know that we don't have power over our users. At most, we have some influence, but not power. And that means we don't get corrupted. We don't face the same temptation. It's power that creates the temptation that corrupts people. If you don't have power, you're pretty much safe from being corrupted. So what you need to do is escape from proprietary software and come live with us in the free world that we have built. We built it with the GNU operating system and Linux, the kernel. Together, these make a complete free operating system that respects your freedom and your community, and thus makes it possible to use a computer in freedom. That's why I started developing GNU. In 1983, I decided I wanted to make it possible to use a computer in freedom, and that means without proprietary software. No proprietary software. Any proprietary program takes away users' freedom and divides their community. That's wrong. If a program says you're not allowed to share this with other people, it is cutting you off from the community. That's evil. And if it asks you to agree that you won't share it with others, then it's trying to morally corrupt you for the sake of your own ethics. You must say no. You must refuse to agree. And if you did agree in the past, well, at least don't carry it out. If you agree to a contract saying that you will treat other people in an unethical, antisocial way, that's no excuse for actually doing it. And with many of these programs, the only copy that is offered in a way that doesn't directly threaten to undermine your character is the unauthorized copy. Anyway, I didn't want to use these programs either authorized or unauthorized. I wanted to escape from them. So I said, I'm going to launch the development of a free operating system called GNU. And the goal is we'll make free replacements for all the proprietary programs that matter, and we'll do everything with free software only. And that way, in our computers at least, we'll have freedom. In 1991, GNU was almost complete, but one major essential component was missing. That was the kernel. The kernel is one of the essential pieces of an operating system. We started developing a kernel in 1990, but our project went slowly, and in 1991, Mr. Torvalds wrote a kernel called Linux. In 91, Linux was non-free software, but in 92, he changed the license and he made it free software. And that meant that Linux could fill the last gap in GNU, producing the GNU/Linux combination, which is basically the GNU system with Linux as the kernel. And that's what people were using. If somebody says he's using Linux, he's using the GNU system and calling it by the wrong name and giving us none of the credit for our work, which is treating us pretty badly. Please don't do that. We need to get credit for the work we've done because we use that credit to show people the importance of the freedom we're working for. We don't influence people as much with our past work if people think that work was done by Mr. Torvalds instead of us. Why did the light go out? Ah, good, thanks. The more light, the better. I mean, we didn't come here to sleep together. So, uh, please, if you talk about this system, call it GNU/Linux and give us equal mention. We started the project. We developed the biggest piece of the code of any single project. I think that's enough to entitle us to equal mention. I call it GNU/Linux to give equal mention to Mr. Torvalds. He wrote an important piece of the system, but he didn't start the whole development. So anyway, in principle, GNU/Linux is a free operating system, but in practice, often it's not, because there are thousands of distributions of GNU/Linux, each one with its own development group, and they decide which programs to add to it. And typically, they add some non-free programs, meaning their distro is not entirely free software, and you can't be assured that it will respect your freedom if you install it. Many of them don't even indicate which programs are non-free software. They don't tell you that they've installed non-free software. There are a few distributions that are entirely free software. Those are the ones we endorse. Look at gnu.org/distros for more information about this. Which distros are free, which are not, and why not, our criteria for judging. Now, I'm going to skip the topic of free software licenses to save some time, but if you're concerned about various free software licenses, please look at gnu.org/licenses. If you want to develop a free program, then look at gnu.org/licenses/license recommendations.html to see which license we'd recommend for your work, and it depends on the circumstances. The license I'm known for developing is the GNU General Public License, or GNU GPL. That's a copyleft license, which means it imposes a condition on redistributors. It says, yeah, you're free to redistribute copies of this program with or without changes. Those are freedoms 2 and 3. But there's a condition about how you distribute it. It's got to be under the same license, and it's got to come with source code, meaning that when you redistribute copies to others, you have to give them the same freedoms that you got from us. Because there are plenty of companies that would be delighted to take our code, turn it into proprietary software, and use our code to subjugate people. Well, it's wrong to subjugate people whether you're doing it with our code or someone else's code or whatever. But when it's our code, we have a way to stop it legally. We can, by means of the GNU General Public License or another copyleft license, we can set it up so that trying to do that is copyright infringement, and we can legally stop them. So, one thing you need to know, you may have heard the term open source. Some of you might think that I'm a supporter of open source. Well, that's not true. That's disinformation. As you can tell from what I've said, I stand for free software. Free as in freedom. For me, this is all about respecting the user's freedom. In 1998, there were people in the free software community who didn't agree with the free software movement. They liked free software, but they They didn't want to criticize proprietary software on moral grounds. So they looked for a way to disconnect our software from our ideas. The way they found was to make up a new term, open source, that hadn't been used in the field before, and then talk about that. And since there's nothing in that term that naturally suggests freedom at all, it was easy for them to make up a different discourse with different ideas, which didn't present this as an issue of right or wrong, but rather only as a matter of convenience. So where we say if you develop and distribute a program, it's your moral duty to respect users' freedom. They say if you develop and distribute a program, uh, you might find it's in your practical interest to let users change and redistribute the program, because then they'll improve the code quality. In other words, they're going out of their way to avoid the idea that there is a matter of that there's anything that users are entitled to in the way of freedom. That's the idea they want to hush up, because it might disturb business executives. It's what business executives would rather we didn't think about. If I had been more politically aware at the time, I might have expected to face some sort of business-oriented depoliticization campaign, but I was surprised by it. Well, the majority of our community agreed with them and started saying open source. Nearly all the businesses started saying open source, and the journalists and politicians mostly followed the businesses. And since then, the important media almost solely say open source. So many people have seen things in the media connecting me with open source that they usually think I'm an advocate of open source. People write to me. Today I read a message from somebody asking me about whether I thought that something was in accord with the spirit of open source licensing. I had to respond by saying, I'm sorry, there's a misunderstanding here. I'm not in favor of open source at all and never was, and here's why. And then eventually answered his question. But the most important thing I have to say is, no, that is not correct. I'm not an advocate of open source. I'm talking about free software here. People report on what I said. I say free software, and they reported I advocated open source. I say no. I've even seen articles that called me the father of open source. So I send a letter to the editor saying, if I'm the father of open source, it was conceived through artificial insemination using stolen sperm without my knowledge or consent. Then I explain about the free software movement, which I really stand for, and that's the real serious purpose of the letter. But I like to start with a joke. So you can see I do as much as I possibly can to correct that error, but it's not enough. I'm not the only one, but we're not enough. We need your help. You can help support the cause of freedom simply by refusing to go along with the distraction of saying it's open source. Especially if you're in a discussion with other people who don't agree. That's your opportunity to make a difference. And even if and don't think in terms of convincing the people who are for open source and changing their mind. No, the people you're going to influence are the lurkers. That's your opportunity to influence people. All you need to do is show that you stand firm in advocating free software, make it clear to everyone on the list what that is and why it's important, and then refuse to be converted. That's enough to lead the lurkers to think about the question, and maybe it will have an influence on them. That's up to them. And by talking about free software, you can show that it's not just a practical question. It's a matter of treating other people ethically, respecting their rights. Now, one crucial thing is that schools should teach exclusively free software. And by teach, I mean leading the students to use a program, bringing a program to the students for them to use it. That should only be done with free software, never a proprietary program. And when I say schools, that means from nursery school to university and adult education, all kinds of schooling. And they shouldn't just do this, they should say why they're doing this. It shouldn't be a mysterious absence of Windows or Mac OS. It should be a reason why it would be wrong to have them in the school. And that is the school has this. What the hell? Oh. The school has a social mission to educate good citizens of a society that is strong, capable, independent, cooperating, and free. In computing, that means teaching them to be skilled users of free software. And to teach a proprietary program is implanting dependence in society, making the students dependent on some particular company or entity that developed that non-free program. It's like teaching them to be drug addicts. The school should never do that. It's contrary to the school's social mission. In addition, schools have to teach people, well, and so schools should explain the civics of this. They should explain this mission, and this is why they only teach free software. They don't want to lead students into doing things that are bad for them and others. In addition, schools have to teach people to cooperate with others, to be good members of society. So every class should have this rule. Students, if you bring a program to class, you may not keep it for yourself. You must share copies with the rest of the class, including the source code, in case someone there wants to learn. Because this class is a place where we share our knowledge. Therefore, it's not permitted to bring proprietary software to class. The school, to set a good example, has to follow its own rule. It should bring only free software to class. Now, I'm pretty sure this university is not following that rule. It's up to you to campaign to make it do so, and to keep raising the issue in terms of right and wrong. Because if you get distracted onto side issues, they'll have some counter-argument. But they have no counter-argument for this. And then there's the matter of education in programming and software design. Every program embodies knowledge. If it's proprietary, it withholds that knowledge from the students. That means it's the enemy of the spirit of education. It should not be tolerated in a school except to do reverse engineering on it. Reverse engineering means trying to extract the knowledge that that program is designed to withhold. It's the only legitimate reason it should be present in the school at all. But free software offers its knowledge freely to the students. It supports the spirit of education. That's the only kind that schools should give their support to. And this is vital to educate good programmers. How do you learn to write good, clear code? You do it by reading lots of code and writing lots of code. But only free software offers the chance to read the code of large programs we really use. Then you have to write changes in these large programs. Only free software offers the chance to write changes in the code of large programs we really use. First you write small changes, then bigger and bigger, and eventually you've learned to write big pieces of big programs. Any school can offer the chance to master the craft of programming if it is a free software school. Human rights depend on each other. If we lose one, it becomes hard to defend the rest. And now that we use computing for so many important activities in life, free software, in other words, control of our computing, has become one of the human rights that are essential for defending the other human rights. And sometimes this requires a sacrifice. There's nothing new about that. Defending freedom sometimes requires a sacrifice. People today are being taught to think that no sacrifice is so small that they could consider doing it. Even a tiny sacrifice of a whim or a convenience is considered by many to be absurdly much. We have education of society, mainly by media full of advertisements, in being unable to put off unimportant things for something that really matters. That's not good for people. There are many people who won't make the tiniest sacrifice for their freedom. You say to them, how about stopping using that proprietary program? And they say, this program is very convenient for me. I like it. And I'll switch to a free program if you show me a free program that is 100% as convenient, fast, reliable, cheap, etc. What they're really saying there is that for them the value of freedom is zero. And you can't make them change their minds. All you can do is cite them as examples to other people. You can't make them stop being foolish. But you can point out, you can use the example of their foolishness to show someone else what it is to be wise. So how do you help our cause? Well, if you're a programmer, you can write free software, if you're a good programmer. I suggest you contribute 15 times to other projects before you start one of your own. By contributing to the others, you'll learn the right way to run a project so that when you start one, you'll do a good job. But not everyone has a talent for programming. There are many other important things you could do that help us that are really crucial forms of help. For instance, you can organize the movement. You could become a free software speaker. That's tremendously important. Or you can become one of the organizers, the people that keep track of the membership list and when there's going to be an activity and remind people and find the people to do the jobs. A free software activist group needs someone like that. If you can do that, you will make a big difference. You can help persuade schools and governments to move to free software. For schools, look at gnu.org/education. For governments, look at gnu.org/government. If you're an expert user, you can help other users. You can start a GNU/Linux user group or join an existing one. If there's an existing GNU/Linux user group that calls itself erroneously a Linux user group, you can go there and help users and also teach people why it really ought to change its name. And simply saying free software when others, especially when others are saying open source, that helps our cause. So software should be free because all users of computing deserve freedom. That's what we have to remember. No matter how convenient a proprietary program is, it subjugates its users. It's wrong. And if you value your freedom enough, you won't think it's a sacrifice to reject that non-free program. Rather, you'll think that it would be a sacrifice to use that program, a sacrifice of your own freedom, and maybe a sacrifice of other people's freedom. So, this is the basic injustice. But there are many other injustices in the digital society, and one of them is surveillance. I've explained how proprietary programs frequently spy on their users, that this is a malicious functionality. By the way, a program with malicious functionalities is called malware. Malware means the program has been designed to run in a way that mistreats its users. This is philosophically totally separate from the question of non-free software, which is about how the program is distributed. The same program could be distributed as free software or as proprietary software. The code would be the same. It's just a matter of how it's made available to users under ethical conditions or unethical conditions. So philosophically, these are entirely independent, whether it's proprietary and whether it's malware. But in practice, the two go together. If it's proprietary, it's likely to be malware, and if it's free software, it's probably not malware. So proprietary software commonly snoops on users, and there we can prevent it by not using proprietary software. But there are other ways of snooping on users that work through systems that don't belong to us and are not in any sense under our control. So we don't have a natural, easy way to protect ourselves there. For instance, Republicans just showed their hostility to Americans by authorizing ISPs to snoop on users and then do whatever they like with that data, and even mess up users' browsing by sticking their own ads and other misleading things into the pages that come back. Well, if the ISP records what a user connects to, that's being done in the ISP's computer. It doesn't belong to the customer. It could be running free software, but those copies belong to the ISP, and the ISP can change them, not you or me. And that's how it should be, right? Why should we have the right to change any program in the ISP's computer? We shouldn't. But the fact is that system is snooping on you, maybe on me if I'm visiting you and connecting through your computer. But it won't see much because I'll browse through Tor anyway. The point is that this is an example of systems that snoop on people but don't belong to them. So we don't have a simple way of changing that. The only way we can stop that is with regulations like the one that Republicans just eliminated. But that regulation didn't go far enough. It only limited what the ISPs could do with the data they accumulate about all their users. Now, surveillance doesn't start with using the data, it starts with collecting the data. That's the dangerous thing. The only personal database that isn't dangerous is the one that was never collected in the first place. Once the data are collected, they will surely be misused. The probability is not exactly 1, but it approaches 1. It can be misused in 4 ways. The organization that collected the data can misuse them, or rogue employees can misuse them, or for instance, I'm reminded of how Uber employees figured out who was having a one-night stand just by seeing what rides they were taking. Uber is a surveillance system because it makes users identify themselves. That should be illegal. If we want privacy, we've got to stop systems from keeping track of who does what and who goes where. And once again, this system doesn't belong to the users. We can't fix it ourselves. But also, another way to misuse the data is crackers can steal the data and misuse it. And this happens more and more, to the point where Bruce Schneier says you should think of a collection of personal data as toxic waste. Don't make the toxic waste. Don't collect the data. You'll be safer. And finally, the data can be taken by, this is the most dangerous of all, the data can be collected, taken by the state from whatever organization accumulated the database. The state can take the whole database. At least in the US it can, with a national security letter. It doesn't even need a court order. And it can take the whole database. Remember how the US government was collecting all the phone records in the country by every so often just saying to various phone companies, give us all the data on the phone calls in the past 3 months. And it did this every 3 months. And now they've changed the mechanics of it. The phone company collects the data and the state decides when to look at the collected data. Small difference. So, because of this, laws to limit how the data are used are not very effective. You see, what is democracy? Democracy means the people control what the state does. And beyond that, democracy is a means for the non-rich to organize and make themselves politically more powerful than the rich, so that the rich can't run society for their benefit alone or primarily. So the problem is that in order for the people to control the state, they need to know what the state is doing. And states more and more do things secretly. How can people control that? They need to find out with the help of whistleblowers. So democracy requires whistleblowers, heroes like Edward Snowden. 3 cheers for Edward Snowden. Hip, hip, hooray. Hip, hip, hooray. Hip, hip, hooray. But the state calls whistleblowers criminals and tries to put them in prison if it can find them. Obama declared war on whistleblowers, war essentially on heroes of democracy, and prosecuted more whistleblowers than in the entire previous history of this country. So if the state knows who goes where and who talks with whom, it's almost impossible to be a whistleblower and not be put in prison, so we won't have enough whistleblowers. We've got to make sure the state doesn't know so much about everybody as to make democracy impossible to carry out. And this is especially important with regard to the systems that are being set up specifically to spy on everyone. For instance, there are now cameras in the streets in many cities that are connected to a network, which means they can be fed into computers remotely, and the FBI has a face recognition system, a face database that covers half the adult population of the country already. And they're surely trying to aim for 100% coverage. And so if they start systematically feeding millions of cameras into this system, they can track who's walking around on the street. We must not allow them to do this. It must be illegal for anyone in the country, even a government agency, to set up cameras that transmit the views over to any other site. We can make exceptions if the camera's quality is not sufficient to recognize anyone. Of course, the concern is for when they're pointing at public places, places where the public is admitted much of the time. However, there's a safe kind of camera that can be used for prevention and detection of crime, and that is a security camera. A security camera makes a local recording which is overwritten after a certain amount of time, and the only way to get that is to go there physically and take it out. Those are safe because when there's a crime, yes, someone can go and get the recording and try to find the culprit, because crimes are rare enough. But to look at all these recordings all the time would be so much work, it's not feasible. So these cameras provide security and don't lend themselves to massive surveillance. Contrast the security camera with a surveillance camera, which is connected to a network so that it can be monitored automatically by AI systems to recognize people. That is too dangerous. We must not allow them to exist. Although, of course, we do want courts to be able to order setting up a camera in a specific place for a specific period of time for probable cause, a reasonable suspicion based on some evidence. That is the system that we developed to protect people from dangerous, overextended power of the state to intrude into everyone's lives. And we've got to extend it to cover digital technology in a way that is really effective. Now, I have a lot more suggestions about specific surveillance systems and how to deal with them. Another one worth mentioning is license plate recognizers. I suggest that a license plate recognizer system should be required to notice only plates that are invalid or plates that are being sought by court order. If a car with a valid license plate that there's no suspicion against drives past, the system shouldn't see it. It should be blind to all those cars. This way, the license plate recognizer would do some good against crime, but it would not threaten the rights of non-criminals. A lot of data is collected when people buy things. Not from me. I don't identify myself when I buy things. I pay cash. It's extremely important to refuse to pay through systems that identify you. I make an exception only in cases where they would demand to know my name anyway. So since we can't even fly on a domestic flight anonymously anymore, I don't do any more harm to myself by using a credit card to pay. Since you can't rent a car without showing your driver's license, well, it wouldn't do me any more harm to use a credit card to pay. In those two cases, I'll do it. Other than that, no thanks. It's cash or no sale. It's very important to do that. However, it would be sort of convenient to be able to buy things over the internet, which I can't do. So we've developed free software to make this possible. It's called GNU Taler, T-A-L-E-R, ctaler.net. It's an anonymous payment system, which is anonymous for the payer, but not anonymous for the payee. In other words, it doesn't help tax evasion. But it does mean that you can buy something over the internet and the payment doesn't identify you, just as when you pay cash, it doesn't identify you. So there are many different kinds of systems that collect personal data, and they need different solutions. But the general rule should be no system should be allowed to collect any personal data that is not inherently necessary for the principal goal that the users want, that the members of the public want. And if the members of and it shouldn't be allowed to collect any data about members of the public who are not engaging intentionally with the system, except under a specific court order. But when you use some kind of service, law should require that service to be designed to function with the minimum possible personal data collection. So, uh, if it's selling you a download of something, it should accept anonymous payment, and it should record nothing about who paid. Nothing. For more information about this, look at gnu.org/philosophy/surveillance-vs-democracy.html. Another threat is censorship. 20 years ago, we used to think that it would not be feasible to censor the internet. Alas, now we know censorship is not very hard. Lots of countries do it. And not only the obvious, visible, tyrannical governments such as China, Iran, Turkey, Russia, increasingly, uh, but instead, but even countries that are supposedly free censor the internet. In 2006, Finland imposed internet censorship, requiring ISPs to block access to a list of sites. This was supposedly because they were obscene. Anyway, somebody in Finland decided to study how this system of censorship worked. So he got a list of sites that might perhaps be, he suspected, be censored, and he tried to connect to them and published a list of the sites that were actually blocked. They blocked access to his site. There was nothing obscene on his site. It was just the result of a journalistic investigation into the functioning of an activity of the state. He went to court. The Supreme Court of Finland approved censoring his site. Now, they didn't require him to take down the page. You could visit it now. It's only blocked from within Finland. In other words, only the people who are subject to this censorship can see what is being done, are the one cannot see what was being done to them in 2007. He has not updated the list since then. It's a list of what was censored in 2007. And it may not be very relevant now if you're interested in looking for porn, but it's just as relevant now as it ever was as documentation of censorship in Finland. There are many kinds of censorship that work differently. In Australia, there is censorship of links. Electronic Frontier Australia, which is an organization that defends human rights in digital activities, was ordered to delete a link to a certain foreign website on pain of being fined 11,000 Australian dollars a day. What was this website? No, it didn't advocate terrorism. It was an anti-abortion website. In other words, the sort of thing that's designed to kill women. I'm sure it's truly disgusting, but they have a right to present their views in Australia or anywhere else. And then there's India. In India, officials can order pages removed from the web. No trial needed. Censorship in India is almost unrestrained. Important, valuable books and movies are censored in India. They simply don't respect freedom of speech. So we've got a campaign against censorship. We have to recognize that whatever people are saying, it's not as dangerous as censorship. The remedy for people saying bad things is to say other things. And in general, when they say that the reason for the censorship is to stop terrorism, we have to remember that in the West, terrorism is a minor danger compared to the big dangers of life. Things like uh, collisions with cars, smoking, air pollution, failure to deploy an adequate medical insurance system in countries such as the U.S. These kill a lot of people. But also, a deranged state, if a state stops respecting human rights, it can kill tremendous numbers of people. This has happened even within living memory. We need a state. We need the state to do many important things for us. We need a state to uh, take action after crimes. We need a state to arrange for everyone to have food and shelter and medical care and education. A state has to build transportation systems, has to fund research. It has to defend the country sometimes from other states. There are many important jobs that we need a state to do. But we've got to make sure to keep it under control and not let it censor us, because if a state goes off the rails, it can be more dangerous than anything else. For instance, if a state is captured by people who deny the danger of global heating, they can kill billions of people. They could end up killing most of humanity, and it could happen within your lifetime. A few decades from now, civilization could collapse because of this. One thing that global heating does is it causes extreme weather, droughts, floods, heat waves. In a few decades, there will start to be fatal heat waves where any exposed human being will die from it in a fairly short time. Well, this tends to cause wars. A drought in Syria appears to have caused the Syrian civil war. Globalized production is very fragile. When the parts of one product are made in lots of different places and shipped around and nobody quite knows where, well, if a war breaks out in any place, it's likely to disrupt production. And people will be surprised how many different things production is no longer possible. So when there are lots of these wars breaking out around the world, globalized manufacturing could cease entirely. It might be impossible to get technology products anymore. And if they're designed to last only 6 months, that's not a lot of time to be able to make production come back. It also causes crop failures. And in a few decades, reliable agriculture won't exist anymore. Farmers will not know how they should try to grow crops this year. They'll only know that the methods that they used in the last few years won't be right anymore. So, because things will be changing so fast. So, a state can be extremely dangerous if we don't make sure it's on the right track, and therefore we shouldn't let states do things that are unjust and dangerous in the name of protecting us from lesser dangers. So, other threats to our freedom in the digital world come from the use of internet services. For instance, many services transmit non-free programs in their pages. These programs are typically written in JavaScript, a certain programming language, but that's just a technical detail. The point is they're in the page, they get installed silently into the browser, and then they run. Now, these programs can be free or non-free, just like any other program. If it comes with source code carrying a free license, it's free software. Otherwise, it's not. But they pose an extra problem because typically what happens is it comes straight from somebody else's computer and runs on your computer. So there's a technical obstacle to exercising control over it, even if it's free. It can be done, but it's inconvenient. It's not as simple as deciding to install that version instead of that version because you like that group's work better. So at the very least, we need to insist that these sites make their JavaScript code free, but really we're better off if we just don't run it at all. Another threat comes from the fact that sites collect lots of personal data. Now, sometimes they do it by surreptitious surveillance, but sometimes they just ask people lots of questions. Or like Facebook, they get some of the useds to provide data about the other useds. And they get people talking to each other, and by what they say, this service learns about all of them. And you just got to be very careful before you give any information about yourself to a website. I basically don't identify myself to websites. With one exception, to post a comment. Well, I'm happy to put my name on the comments I post. Fortunately, I'm in a position where it's not dangerous for me to do so for the most part. And so I do it, identify myself in that case, and I don't mind. I'm not identifying myself to the site. I'm identifying myself to the readers of the site. But in general, we shouldn't let our data be stored on servers belonging to other entities than ourselves. Keep in mind that there's no such thing as, quote, the cloud, unquote. That's just another word for computers belonging to various people, companies, and states. And it matters who owns any particular server you're thinking of talking to. And remember that the server you might talk to might exchange data with other servers and you wouldn't even know. If it occurs to you that it might matter to you what the privacy policy of a site says, you probably shouldn't use that site at all. Because those privacy notices are written to be hard to understand, essentially to mislead the users into thinking, as Evan Moblin put it, that they have promised something when in fact nothing has been promised. So, and if the site expects you to agree to some terms for using it, almost certainly you shouldn't. So, that's another thing to watch out for. And Finally, you should never entrust your own computing activity to somebody else's server, because that way the somebody else, the entity that owns the server and decides what it will control your computing activity. It's equivalent to doing your computing with a non-free program. With a non-free program, you have a copy of it. You're running the program, but you don't control what it does. The developer and owner of the program controls what it does. If you entrust that same computing activity to someone else's server, the server owner controls how it's done. It's the same problem. It comes about through two different routes, but it's the same problem. And in both cases, for your freedom's sake, you've got to say no. That case is known as service as a software substitute, or SaaS, meaning a service is doing a job that should have been done by your copy of a program running on your computer. And that's to use a free program in that way is the only way you can possibly have control over what it's doing. We should note that communicating with others is a different kind of case. To have your computer communicate with my computer, they're going to have to talk through the network. They're going to have to use computers belonging to lots of others that make up the network. That's different from letting a server do your own computing. Your own computing, you could in principle do with your computer by running free software without talking to anybody else's computer at all. And that's the right way. So, another threat to our freedom in the digital world comes from using computers for voting. You can't trust computers in voting. Voting is special because there's no way to tell whether the system counted your vote correctly, no way to tell whether spurious votes were put in, say, by somebody rigging the voting machine. It's just as easy to falsify 1,000 votes as one vote. It is possible to have fraud with paper ballots, but the bigger the fraud is, the harder it is to hide. And not only that, you don't have to be a programmer or a specialist to understand how the paper ballot voting system works. Parties train poll watchers. Anybody of normal intelligence can learn to understand how the system should work and what that looks like and what fraud would look like. And then you can be an effective poll watcher and help keep the system honest. But you can't do that when there's a machine that counts votes and eventually spits out a total. How do you know those totals are right? You don't. And often they've been wrong. There's been evidence of falsification in U.S. elections due to computerized voting machines. In Ohio in 2004, there was evidence that W stole his second presidential election by the machines that counted the paper ballots. This should have been detectable by recounts, but they put up so many obstacles to actually doing a recount that no one could actually tell. And the same thing happened the last time. Republicans brought up legal issues and delayed until it was too late. But if we don't have a real possibility of a recount, how can we stop election fraud? Now, there's no evidence for massive numbers of voters fraudulently voting, but we know plenty of evidence for fraud in elections carried out by election authorities. And we must have a system which allows us to take effective action against that when it happens. We don't know that there was fraud in the counting of ballots last November. The aim of those recounts was to find out if there was any. We do know, however, that the election was rigged. It was not fair because Republicans in various states systematically blocked minority group voters from voting. And this has been thoroughly documented. I have a link on stallman.org. Another threat to our freedom in the digital society comes from, oh, and by the way, there's a page, stallman.org/evoting.html, which explains these dangers with references to teams that have investigated the problem. Another threat comes from the war on sharing. Digital technology is valuable because it facilitates uh, copying, manipulating, and transmitting information. But there's some who don't want us to be able to get the benefit of that don't want us, for instance, to be able to share copies of publications, which is a tremendously useful thing to do. They want to be the only ones that can get this benefit. And for decades now, they've been fighting a war against people that try to share copies. They started with propaganda. They called people who shared pirates. Now, pirate was a term that authors used to condemn publishers that published without the author's permission. But then the publishers started using it to attack people who shared with other people. Now, that's a vicious slur, but it's just name calling, and if that's all they had done, it wouldn't be a war. But they didn't stop there. They started perverting our technology with digital restrictions management, turning it into a scheme to turning our digital devices into our prison guards. They no longer serve us. Their purpose is to control us and stop us. But they didn't stop there. Then they purchased a law to make it a crime to break these handcuffs. And even more of a crime to show people how they can break these handcuffs, so that many quite useful programs can only be distributed underground in the US and now in many other countries as well. And then they started prosecuting hundreds of thousands of teenagers for hundreds of thousands of dollars each. Made a lot of people hate them. They ruined some people's lives that way. And then they went further. They set up a scheme to punish people with disconnection from the internet or other punishments when they are merely accused of sharing. No need to prove it. So their determination to impose their empire over internet users has led to abolishing the basic principle of justice, which is no punishment without a fair trial. The trial is considered superfluous. They don't need to prove that anyone committed the so-called crime. Just the accusation should suffice, according to them. And in Japan, they've gone even further. They've established a penalty of 3 years in prison for downloading an unauthorized copy of anything from the internet. Uploading is punished with 10 years in prison. I suppose the next step will be to execute anyone convicted of forbidden cooperation. Well, it's not just the measures that are an injustice. Their goal is an injustice. Sharing is good. Sharing is cooperation in society. Sharing must be legal. It's no accident that they keep proposing ever nastier measures to stop people from sharing. Sharing is good, and with digital technology, sharing is generally easy unless they can impose obstacles. So the only way they could stop people from sharing is through draconian, nasty measures. And I suppose that they will keep choosing ever nastier measures until we put a stop to their entire unjust war by legalizing sharing and making sure that they can't use any other legal or technical obstacles to make sharing difficult. So, for instance, making products or selling products, leasing out products with DRM, that should be a crime. Imposing on people contracts saying they won't share, well, that should just be legally void because it's against the interest of society to divide people that way. So we have to legalize sharing, and what this means is a change in copyright law. Now, I don't believe in abolishing copyright law entirely, but we have to reduce the power that copyright gives people or gives owners to control others. I've proposed that copyright should last for 10 years from the date of original publication of the work. And copyright on, well, works that are designed for practical use should be free. Because, and the same arguments that apply to software apply to any work that's designed for practical use. In order for people using the work to be free, they have to have control over it. And that requires the four freedoms. But there are other kinds of works that aren't meant for practical use. For instance, art and fiction. They're to be appreciated. You don't use a novel or a poem in a practical way to get a job done. That's not what they're for. That's not how they contribute to society. Likewise, works of testimony or opinion, they're not made to be used in a practical way. They're made to show people information or ideas. So the argument doesn't apply there. That's why this talk doesn't have to be free in moral terms. It's not a work for practical jobs. It's a work to show what I think. Then you can think about it and decide whether you agree. So for works that are not meant for practical use, I propose a somewhat reduced copyright system, which would cover all modification and all commercial use. But everyone would be free to share exact copies, and by sharing I mean, well, everybody should be free to share any published work, and by sharing I mean non-commercial redistribution of exact copies. So this doesn't abolish copyright, it just takes copyright off of one kind of case. Now, as a way to support artists, I have two proposals. First of all, there are many ways artists support themselves now that would continue with this system. That this proposal just doesn't change at all. For instance, selling copies. Well, I have no objection to selling copies. Selling tickets to a performance, I have no objection to that. This change wouldn't stop that. They would go on doing it. Selling copies or selling other kinds of things at a performance, the way the Free Software Foundation is doing right out there. Nothing wrong with that. This wouldn't change anything about that. Uh, Crowdfunding works pretty well. Well, I'm not proposing to change that. So, yes, there'd still be ways for artists and other writers to get income. But I'd like to propose two new ones. One of them would work through the state. The state would collect some money and make available a certain amount of money each year to support artists based on their popularity, because that's what the copyright system supposedly does. I'm just being conservative. I'm not changing that. Okay, but how do you measure their popularity? You use some kind of polling or measurement of the frequency of sharing things on the net, and then you get a popularity figure for each artist. And then how do you distribute the money? Not in linear popularity, in linear proportion to popularity, because that wouldn't give too much money to the stars. It wouldn't be an effective way of supporting the arts, which, by the way, is the goal that legitimizes copyright under the U.S. Constitution. So what I propose is take the cube root of the popularity of each artist and distribute the money in proportion to the cube roots. So the cube root of 1,000 is 10. Suppose star A is 1,000 times as popular as good and fairly appreciated artist B. With linear proportion, A would get 1,000 times as much as B, meaning that almost all of that money would go to the stars, and it would do no good for the arts. It would only make stars richer. But with the cube root, A would now get 10 times as much money as B. The effect of the cube root is to transfer most of the money from the stars to the many mid-range popularity artists. And thus we would get a system that uses the funds efficiently to support the arts where they really need it. Not at the artists nobody's interested in, not for the stars who don't need any more, but rather for the artists that are not quite stars, but they're getting there. They're important. The other idea is with voluntary payments. Suppose each player device has a button you can push and it sends a quarter to the artist that made the work you just listened to or that you're listening to now. If you don't do this, nothing will punish you. But if you do it, you'll feel good. And it's just a quarter. Why not? A lot of people might do this every day. Of course, it has to be anonymous. It could use GNU Thaler. The idea is economists could calculate the size of the payment to maximize the amount that people send per unit time. And that would be the best amount for it to send. And then we could have public service announcements reminding people how good they'll feel if they push the button and send a little money to the artists. Now, one interesting point about this is that in the U.S., it was not possible to set up a system of punishing the users for sharing without convicting them of anything. It would be unconstitutional. So Obama negotiated a contract between the major ISPs and the major Hollywood and music industry companies, where the ISPs agree to mistreat and punish their own customers for the sake of those other companies. This was possible because their users don't really have any rights. Users of the internet don't have any actual rights to do anything in the US. And the network neutrality that we enjoy is rather limited. True network neutrality means the ISPs don't know what you're doing. They don't keep any notes. They don't interfere, period. The network neutrality we have is incomplete. It permits the ISPs to mistreat their customers in cahoots with Hollywood. But this is an example of a more general point that we don't really have the right to do any particular thing on the internet. If you have an opinion you want to show people, you can write a sign and walk around on the street and people may see it. You can print papers and hand them out. You don't have to get permission from anyone for this because it's your right. But if you want to do the same thing on the internet, you need cooperation from various companies, such as an ISP, a domain name registrar, and a hosting company. And if they and they can cut you off essentially arbitrarily. Each one has terms of service written by it and interprets those terms of service, which means basically it's a prosecutor, judge, and executioner. It decides whether you're allowed to use that service. And if it doesn't like what you're saying, it can just stop you. That's not freedom of speech. We discovered this with the example of WikiLeaks. After Chelsea Manning showed us things such as the collateral murder video, the U.S. government freaked out to put, well, at the time, him in prison. And and also to drive WikiLeaks off the internet for having published these revelations. But WikiLeaks hadn't committed a crime. There was nothing to prosecute. How to drive WikiLeaks off the internet? Well, an official talked to Amazon because WikiLeaks had rented an Amazon virtual server and convinced Amazon to interpret its terms of service to forbid publishing leaks. And so Amazon shut down WikiLeaks' server. And then the U.S. started getting rid of various domain names that WikiLeaks was using. But Switzerland wouldn't listen. So it couldn't get rid of wikileaks.ch. And then it decided to cut off volunteers' donations to WikiLeaks by convincing all the payment companies to refuse to transfer any money there. So PayPal and Google and Bank of America and Visa and MasterCard, they all refused to transfer money to WikiLeaks. Then a company in Iceland decided to accept donations on behalf of WikiLeaks. They cut it off too. And at that point, there was resistance because the European Union has a law saying that a company that has more than 10% of any given market is not allowed to discontinue service to any client without cause. So that company sued and won. They had to reestablish payments to that company, which is allowed to donate to WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks has not been convicted of any crime or shut down. So, of course, Bitcoin also helped with the payment problem. It's possible to send money to WikiLeaks or anyone else through Bitcoin. But this shows us that we need to establish that people have certain rights when they use vital internet services such as an ISP. They have the right to do things, not just a right not to have their data published to other businesses, but they have a right to send the data they want to send, and that the company can't arbitrarily interfere. I don't know how it is here, but in Boston, if you rent an apartment and you sign a lease, the landlord is not allowed to put in any conditions whatsoever. There's a list of conditions that are legally valid, and anything else, they could say you have to wear a blue shirt every day. It doesn't matter if they say it. You don't have to do it. They could put in something saying the landlord doesn't have to offer you heat in the winter. And that's totally void. The landlord still has to offer you heat in the winter, according to the law. Well, in other words, the terms of these leases are mostly determined by a democratic state and not by the landlord. We've got to do the same thing for ISPs and various other kinds of internet services. We can't let them write their own terms of service and then treat those essentially as laws that they wrote. So, for more information about GNU and the free software movement, please look at gnu.org. In gnu.org/philosophy, we answer many philosophical and political questions. gnu.org/licenses explains everything about licensing. gnu.org/distros talks about GNU/Linux distros and which are free and which are not. gnu.org/GNU discusses the history of GNU. gnu.org/education explains things about free software in schools. And by the way, if a school gives a student a mobile device with non-free software in it, it's mistreating that student's rights. And if it makes an account with any service in the name of the student, it has violated the student's privacy. In gnu.org/government explains why and how government agencies need to stop using proprietary software for the sake of the digital sovereignty, the computational sovereignty of the country, and national security. Remember that a non-free program offers no security against its developer. Well, if a country has agencies that do critical functions, like the army, the police, the firemen, the railroads, the electric power, the telephone network, and they're running a non-free program, that endangers national security. They should be required to move to free software and stay there.
Okay, I'm sorry to be the landlord.
By the way, to join the Free Software Foundation, we need your support. You can go to fsf.org, or you can get a card out there and fill in data and then join paying me your dues in cash.
Rich, I'm really sorry to cut it off.
Oh,
Richard,
there's one other thing I have to do, and that's auction the GNU.
Okay, that's a good idea. Okay.
Yeah, this is an adorable GNU that needs a home. So I'm going to auction it for the benefit of the Free Software Foundation. If you buy it, I can sign the card for you. If you have a penguin at home, you need to get a GNU for your penguin, because a penguin can't hardly function without a GNU. When you bid, please wave your arm and shout the amount you're bidding so I hear it, as I have hearing problems. And we can accept payment in cash, with a check, with a credit card, or in Bitcoin if you have something to make the payment with here in front of me. And there is an ATM nearby. I'll be answering questions. You can go out and come back with your money. Yeah. And I'm going to start with the regular price of $25. Do I get 25? How much?
25.
I've got 25. I've got 30. Do I get 35?
40.
I've got 40. Do I get 45?
45.
What?
45.
I've got 45. Do I get 50?
50.
What?
50.
I've got 50. Do I get 55 or more? 55 or more? 55. Do I get 60?
60.
60. Do I get 65? $65 for this adorable.
66 and
60 cents.
66.60. Do I get 70?
80.
I've got 80. Do I get 85? I've got 80. Do I get 85? What?
90.
I've got 90. Do I get 100? I've got 90. Do I get 100 for this adorable baby? I've got 90. Cash, check, credit card, or Bitcoin. I've got 90. Do I get 100 for this adorable baby?
Okay.
Last chance to bid 100 or more for this adorable GNU. Last chance. Going. Gone for 90. How do you wish to pay? How do you wish to pay?
Please, because I know
Okay.
you're only showed to 5, but Richard's agreed to stay for a few questions if some people want to stay.
And please buy things on your way out. We need your support. You can also leave donations of whatever size in the donation